What's up, guys? I'm back with another video today. This time I'm going to make a real tier list. The last one was pretty well received. People thought it was funny. I'm appreciative of that. But it didn't fall in line with the normal content on my channel, which is pretty competitively oriented and serious. So I decided I'll make a real tier list for Edison. Now, the tiers are going to be pretty much the same. I do not have an F tier this time, as I don't think any of these decks are actually unplayable. But there are definitely still some D tier decks on this list that I don't think are even good, like in casual play anymore. But I'll kind of, run back over these tiers. S is for the best decks in the format that people are respecting with their main and side deck. A tier are for the decks that are just under S tier. People are siding for them. They're very popular decks, and they have the pretty good potential to win tournaments alongside of the S tier decks, but they don't really receive a lot of main deck respect. B tier decks are decks that, if they are well prepared, a good player is piloting them, very good meta call, these decks aren't really mained or sided for, but they can easily come out of nowhere and do very well in a tournament. C tier decks are, again, decks where if you are very good with the deck, you can maybe get a top with it, maybe win the tournament, but most likely just a top spot, because they do kind of lose out to the better decks of the format, especially once you get to top cut and everyone's playing pretty well. And D tier decks are, again, decks that are they've just come and gone, and they're not even really suited for casual play in the format anymore, I don't think. So again, only decks that have gotten a top 8 since Edison Legends back in 2021. So let's get started. For all the same reasons in the previous video, Blackwings are most certainly the premier S tier deck of the format. Between all the main deck hate that other decks have for them, even though they're kind of bad in certain matchups, bottomless, deep prison, people are still maining these cards left and right because they hurt Blackwings so bad. They are counter-siding for cards like Deck Devastation Virus, Royal Oppression, things that Blackwings can play and most other decks can't. So that was in the previous video, that was a pretty serious statement that I made about Blackwings. They are most certainly the premier S tier deck of the format. They are the deck to beat, and there's really not much else to say about it. I mean, it's pretty obvious from the results that Blackwings are favored to win a tournament on a given day based on the numbers, and it's only going to come down to pretty much the matchup luck in the top cut, whether or not they actually do it. Another deck that I think is S tier is Diva Zombie. Zombies are, without a doubt, one of the most resilient decks, even though they lose to Oppression, and that's kind of their biggest downfall. The fact that they have so many floaters, so many ways to recur their resources and search their resources, they can just kind of loop everything. They have access to return. They have access to easy OTK plays. And if any chip damage is done throughout the course of the game, then it just gets even easier. Fewer cards are needed. They can play through back row because Goblin Zombie, Mystic Tomato, keep giving them constant advantage. They survive through battle. They survive through back row. They have Caius. They have Diva. They just have so many options and tools. They're like right up there neck and neck with Blackwings in terms of decks to beat in a tournament. I don't think people are maining as hard for them. Most people are respecting Blackwings more in their main deck by not playing Oppression at the moment. But Zombies are going to be heavily sided for because they are without a doubt one of the best decks of the format. Following that, I think that the only other deck that's really S tier would be Value Turbo. Normally, I would say that the best 3 decks in the format are Blackwing, Zombie, and Heroes. I just kind of lump Value Turbo in with Blackwings when I talk about it, in this sense. But I think that Value Turbo has a lot of qualities that Blackwing doesn't, which is that its slower starts are less punishable and more malleable. It's a Hamster Raikou Caius deck at its core with the value stuff. capitalize off of a Raikou Mills, and I think it is the best Hamster Raikou Caius deck in the format. It can also side deck Devastation Virus, much like regular Blackwings can, and they can actually use it even better because Vayu is simply capable of summoning the 2300 outright. You don't have to worry about Colute, you don't have to waste Blizzard going into Armed Wing instead of Goyo. The only main deck Blackwing without a boost that regular Blackwing can use is Sirocco, but in Vayu you have the Sirocco, you have the free Armed Wing, you have the Caius. You even have Chaos Sorcerer and Dark Armed Dragon if it comes down to it. So, I absolutely definitely think that Vayu Turbo is up there in S tier. So, now speaking of Hero, we can talk about Hero Beat and Diva Hero Beat. I'm going to lump these two together again. But they are different decks in how they play. Especially on their turn 1. I think that the Diva Hero Beat deck has a better turn 1 play, and also has better follow-up plays. It has a stronger normal summon in that once you already have Alias out, and your Gemini Sparks and your Hero Blaster turned on, you don't really need to be adding more heroes most of the time, so now you can normal summon a Diva, you can get Synchro plays going, you can get a free Android, free Catastor. I would say that Diva Hero Beat is absolutely A tier at the minimum. It might push into S tier because of how good it is, but I don't think anyone is even close to maining for this deck. But people definitely are siding cards for it, whether consciously or not. Like, there are a lot of cards that you side, like Cyber Dragon, and even DD Warrior Lady is picking up steam in side decks now. And but as far as main deck goes, no one's really like playing anything outside of people still maining Oppression, or maybe someone's maining Crow for the Hero Blasts. But that's not really dedicated main deck hate for this deck. I also don't think it's like generally as good as Blackwings, even though it has a very good matchup against them. But these three decks up at the top that I have here are even though this deck's matchups against them is fine, I think that they're a little far above it in terms of how much respect people are giving them, and how unfair it is that, again, you're basically siding for side deck against these decks rather than for whatever they're doing in the main, or even on top of whatever they're doing in the main deck. So it can be really difficult to side against those decks. Whereas Diva Hero Beat, I don't think it really has that big of an issue. And regular Hero Beat, I would put in B tier because it doesn't have the same explosive plays that Diva has. It instead uses like Captain Gold and Skyscraper. It's not a bad deck by any means. But I think it has to kind of come out of nowhere compared to Diva Hero Beat, which I could reasonably expect to get top 8 in any tournament that it enters. Moving on, let's talk about Fairies. Fairies are absolutely an A tier deck. There's a lot of side deck hate going around for Fairies, largely because it loses to the same side deck hate that Lightsworns do. Lightsworns are also an A tier deck, and I'm going to talk about them together. These decks are very popular, especially Lightsworn, because Lightsworn is significantly easier to play, though it's deceptively easy. Like, it looks easy on the surface, but playing correctly with Lightsworn is actually quite difficult over the course of the whole tournament, and there are a lot of lines that you have to know. But both of these decks lose to a very common side deck card called Light Imprisoning Mirror, and both of these decks receive a lot of respect in the side deck because of people siding that. Judgment Dragon is very powerful, Archer Christie is very powerful. People really do need to stop these decks. Fairies float through everything. Fairies have a very, very good matchup against Blackwings. The matchup is almost 100-0, it feels like. Even though Blackwings can side deck dev, Fairies can counter side forward into Ryo, which shuts off Whirlwind. Like, Freed doesn't die to deck dev. In fact, deck dev only fuels Freed. It can literally accidentally turn on Christia, which is very funny. Yeah, so it almost pushes Fairies into the S tier territory just because of how good its matchup is against these, especially the two Blackwing variants. But I think it's worse against Vayu Turbo than against Blackwing because Vayu Turbo has Caius, and yes, you have Herald for Caius, but I wouldn't really rely on that too much. And I think Herald against zombies is very good, but I don't think the deck on the whole is very good against zombies, even though it has DD Warrior Lady for the Goblins and Tomatoes. If you don't have access to the DD Warrior Lady, because your Shining Angel's never grabbing it in that matchup. If you don't already have access to it, it is actually a little difficult to get the DD Warrior Lady off, and they also have Return. You have Return, but it's the matchup's not any worse than even for zombies, absolutely. This deck is probably the top of A tier. I'm not really going to worry too much about like where the decks fall within the tiers. I'm just going to kind of put them in there, and you can argue about that in the comments or whatever. But all three of these decks are definitely very capable of contending with these S tier decks. Like, absolutely capable. And capable of topping and winning any tournament that they pull up to, I think. Fairies, notably more difficult because it is a value deck. It's hard to play and get the most out of all your cards. But, I mean, I would say that the people topping tournaments are for a large part good players in the format, so I would trust many of them to win with Fairies if it came to it. So, yeah. Moving on, Frogs, absolutely an A-tier deck. Frogs receive so much side hate, but it's in fact the side hate that stops them from being S-tier, I think. Frogs are the deck that it's harder to... I'm not really sure how I should put this. It's harder to win with the deck, or sorry, it's harder to lose with the deck than it is to win with it, it feels like. In game one, at least, where, you know, as long as you don't brick, if you're setting up the Duplock, you're constantly bringing back Treeborn to tribute from Monarchs, you have Swap Frog to bounce the Monarchs back to protect them and reuse them. It literally feels harder to lose with Frogs than it feels to win with them at times. Frogs are also very versatile in that because they enable so many tribute summon strategies or synchro strategies, because of their low levels, which makes it very easy to stack up, you know, whatever levels of synchro that you want. Especially the very versatile level 1 Treeborn. But there's just so many different things you can do with Frogs. Your opponent doesn't really ever know what's going to happen. The most common builds of Frogs at the moment are Hero and Junk. I think that those are the two most successful and probably best standard lists of Frogs. But you can literally do anything with them. Fairies, machines. Ronak played Gladiator Beast Frogs once, which was, I think it's kind of silly. He played Moray of Greed to put back Vermillo and Rediari and stuff like that. It was Diva Frog is I think Diva Frog's the best build of Frog, even though it's not the most popular at the moment. That's a point of contention among many. But yeah, I would definitely say that Frogs are an A tier deck. But they will probably never push into S tier just because the side deck hate they receive is so great. People are always going to be constantly siding for Frogs, whether they've done anything or not. It's actually really annoying if you're a Frog player to know that your deck cannot have topped a tournament for 10 tournaments in a row, but people are going to be siding for you anyway. And yeah, I think that's just what keeps the deck from pushing into S tier. I don't think it has like incredible tournament winning chances as long as people still side, you know, that heavily for it, and it's also not well represented. I think Frogs are mostly a little hard to play. There are some brain dead things you can do. You know, you can just set up a Duplock, you can summon an absolute zero in those builds, but over the course of the tournament, Frogs are not, for the most part, a helmet strategy, so it's actually pretty difficult to use them. There are a lot of things that I think keep Frogs out of the S tier, but they are pretty solidly planted in the A tier for me. They are one of the better decks of the format and definitely capable of winning tournaments, but you have to play it very well. Dragon Turbo. I would call this deck B tier, and the reason why is because it bricks so much, and I had a lot of that in Peak of the Beak when I got top 4 with Dragon Turbo. I didn't pop off very many times at all that tournament. I had to play and win actual real matches, and when half of the cards in your deck aren't real, it's actually very difficult to do. And when the deck does pop off, it's very obviously the best deck in the format. It's between that or Frog FTK. Like, if those decks do what they want to do, they're very obviously the best decks in the format because they just win the game. But it just doesn't really happen like that. And I think Dragon Turbo kind of has to creep up out of nowhere. There's a lot of side hate that can go around for it. But unlike Frogs, the side hate for it is not like exceptionally common. and you can counterside against DD Crow, whereas with Frogs you can't really do that very well. You have to, with Frogs you can like some kind of philosophical countersiding where you play differently post side, but like you can't actually counterside. Like with Dragon Turbo, you can cut the Magical Stone Excavation for Avarice. You make your opponent's DD Crow useless. There are certain other cards that you can counterside for. But for the most part, Dragon Turbo does well when people aren't siding those cards and it comes out of nowhere. You kind of have to let the deck rest every few tournaments if you're going to be playing it in order to see some success of it in the next tournament. So I think that pretty solidly plants it in B tier in that it's one of the better decks that are definitely capable of doing something, but absolutely they're very difficult to get anything done with, like, long term. Another B tier deck is Machina. Whatever variant you play, it could be Machina Gadgets, it could be with the Hamster Raikokaya stuff. There are some other variants I've seen, like Machina Quick Draw. All of that's really the same Machina deck to me, and I think it's B tier. We saw from Deck Death 3 that the deck kind of came out of nowhere. It got 2 top 12 slots. But the other, it's just like Frogs. Cyber Dragon is in every side deck already. Plus, there are cards like System Down that if the deck ever got really popular would just instantly shoot it down. Luckily, System Down's pretty bad because no one's really playing Machina like that, so you can get away with playing Machina for a while whenever you do play it. But I would say that this deck is more or less just a rogue option, and it's very capable of coming out of nowhere and winning a tournament if you're very good with it, or at least topping a tournament. Winning might be a little more difficult, again, like I said, for decks like Fairies, Lightsworn. Once you get into the top cuts, players are all very well prepared for everything, I think. But as far as like getting through Swiss and getting to top cut, I definitely think Machina are, they have huge potential for that. But they lose to, the most common side deck card in the format, which is a big issue, I think. So I'm not too impressed with Machina on the whole, but it's certainly not a bad deck. I actually think it's a very good deck, regardless of, like I said, whichever build you play. I think that Fortress is an insane card. Force is just searchable Reborn for it. The deck has a lot of options, and it can do a lot of things in a turn. And, I mean, Fortress on its own, literally just Fortress Swing Pass is actually huge pressure on the opponent because of his hand rip effect. They can't really Raikou it safely. They can't Caius it safely. The Destruction effect, you can't Goyo over it. Even if you Goyoed it over it safely, they kill it and they get their effect because it has low defense. So they can just run back over it and then they get 2 pops and stuff. It's really difficult to deal with a Fortress, and that's what I think solidly plants this deck in B tier. Like, it's a very good deck, but it just loses to a lot of common side, and I don't necessarily trust it to go all the way in every tournament, but in every few tournaments, every once in a while, I would never be surprised to see a Machina top, like, every third tournament, probably, I would say, I would expect to see a Machina top. I wouldn't be surprised in the slightest. Moving on to Disaster Dragon. I think this deck is a C tier deck. I think that it's capable in the hands of a very good player, or if a meta is just completely unprepared for what it has to offer. But it just does not have that ceiling that Dragon Turbo has. I don't think it has the overall consistency that decks like Hero Beat or Machina have. There's just, you can't really convince me it's better than Dragon Turbo anyway. It has access to, Red Eyes Darkness Metal Dragon and Kwakimeru Dragu the exact same way. But it's honestly just not even as good at summoning them, which is a bit of an issue. But because it has trap cards instead of a bunch of very often dead draw cards and avarices and stuff, it's definitely very capable of saying, like, of looking at its Dragon Turbo brother and saying, well, I can do this, this, and this better than you, and in a meta where we have, faster decks like Blackwing that would beat you down, my trap cards can save me. It's very capable of doing something like that, and I'm not mad at, like, seeing the deck in a top cut anyway, because It's a very interesting deck for sure. It's more interesting with Dragon Turbo, I think, though I do prefer to play Dragon Turbo. Moving on, I think Gladiator Beasts are also a C tier deck. I do not think they are unplayable. They are one of my favorite decks. It would suck if they were truly unplayable. I think you have to be very, very good or very, very disrespectful of your opponent to win with Gladiator Beasts, or both. And I'm just not convinced on the whole that the deck is consistent enough or powerful enough to get to like consistent top cuts. Like we've seen like 2 in a row. It topped Edison Legends and then it didn't get another top for like a year after. The deck just has a lot of issues. It's very normal summon reliant. It's very bricky when it does have many normal summons in hand. You can play 10 monsters and still draw 4 of them, it feels like. And on top of that, it just plays mostly trap cards in its current state, which are just worse than monsters on the whole. Your opponent will never really have a wrong Blackwing monster, but you can most assuredly have a wrong trap for them. And of course, like I said in the previous video, it does have a bad matchup against Blackwings. It's like 70-30, I feel like. Blackwings can just get over every, Colute, especially double Colute, because you can Colute damage step, and then if they Chariot, you Colute and damage calculation. You just can't ever win against that, unless you have 2 Chariots, but Chariot on its own is also actually kind of bad against Blackwings because of Sirocco being bigger than all the Gladiator Beasts, so it runs over the Blackwing and makes it dead pretty often. Or sorry, runs over the Gladiator Beast and makes it dead pretty often. It's actually really, really tough for Gladiator Beast to get a good foothold in the matchup and, just have a solid position that a Blackwing player can't break with a top deck or 2. Diva Hero. I think that this deck is pretty, I think it's B tier. I've been playing it a lot lately. I'm actually pretty impressed with my build. I'm not, very convinced that it's, anywhere close to Blackwing or Zombie or even Fairy. But I do think that Absolute Zero is a pretty insane card, but I think that the problem is that Absolute Zero is not exclusive to this deck. Hero Frogs, Diva Hero Beat, even regular Hero Beat. I think Diva Hero is probably better than regular Hero Beat, but like I said, I'm not really worried too much about the actual placement inside the tiers. But all those decks can also play Miracle and Absolute Zero. And so he's just not really exclusive to the deck. Like what you're really looking for in Diva Hero, if it's different from Diva Hero Beat or regular Hero Beat, is Caius. And of course, we're not even, obviously Frogs play Caius as well. We're not going to compare to Frogs for that because they just have such different playstyles. But the main difference is cards like Caius, Dark Grepher, Dark Armed Dragon. The fact that Diva Hero has access to these cards and the other 2 decks don't really is, it's actually really good for it. I think it actually puts it in a good spot in those matchups particularly. The problem is, of course, if they have Gemini Spark, then, banishing their alias is all of a sudden not exceptional. You can't really play Honest like you can in these 2 decks. You lose out on a lot of things, but you get access to cards like Return, which I don't play, but people have been convincing me. I think I'll probably try it out. But you get access to, Caius, Grepher, Dark Armed, Return, all kinds of cards that you don't really get access to these other decks. So I think that makes it a solid contender for a B tier deck. You could argue it's C tier. I don't think you can argue it's A tier. But I think it's solidly in this, unexpectedly out of nowhere. I think it loses to Oppression, which is pretty crappy. But so do a lot of these decks in this area of the chart, and it's like I don't think you can really gauge everything based on Oppression because the Zombies lose to Oppression, and I put them in S tier. So I don't think Oppression really matters that much on the whole. Quick Draw. Quick Draw is probably one of the better C tier decks, I think. I'm very unimpressed with it. Any build of it that I play. The normal Hamster Raikou Caius builds with Titaniol on fire, I feel like those are outclassed by Value Turbo. The build I've been playing recently of Tomatoes and Sphere of Chaos it's very smooth, but it feels like it's much worse than fairies, frogs, Blackwings especially. Argument can be made for this deck to be B tier. I don't think it's incapable of topping a tournament. I think that its issue is there are no free wins. You have to fight for everything. And that means that only really good players are going to consistently be able to top of it. I think that it has... I think the access to the Drill Loop is very good against Blackwings, but at the same time, if they're playing Triple Bora, which they should be doing, you can just lose out of nowhere because you have a 0 defense monster on the field. So while against other decks in the format, not against Christie, of course, but maybe against zombies, you have a good matchup because you can loop with Drill, and it's hard to stop you. They have Phoenix Wing, but they have to have it like first before you make the Drill. Phoenix Wing is probably definitely the best out to Drill Warrior, though. They don't really have to have it first either. They can draw it afterwards, but once you get like a single Drill Loop going, it's not really that crazy for them to Phoenix Wing the Drill after. Like once you get the add back, you normally are picking an option that's resilient to you getting Phoenix Wing, Compulsed, whatever. And of course, Bottomless and Deep Prison don't really matter to Drill Warrior. And against Value Turbo, I think that looping the Dandy tokens is really, really good. I actually think it has a decent matchup against Value Turbo just because of that, but I think the Value Turbo is, again, the better and more resilient Hamster Raikou Caius deck, because at the end of the day, both of these decks are just kind of defined by the fact that they can play that engine and do it very well, and I think Value does it better because milling Value Sirocco is better than milling Dandelion, because in Quick Draw, the only card you really want to mill is Dandelion. Once you mill the debris, you're banking on resolving a Drill Warrior, you're banking on resolving an Avarice, whereas in Value, everything you mill is fine. You never really have a bad Raikou unless it mills like Storm Burial Dad, and you're like, okay, today's not my day. But the average mills in Value are just so much better than in Quick Draw that I just don't trust this deck over Value Turbo. Moving on, Flamvel, I think that this deck is D tier. It only has one top, like I mentioned in the previous video. I think that it is, it's, like I called Firedog Boneless Shura, and I honestly wasn't kidding. It just only summons the one thing, and the one thing that it does loses to Caius. Like, it has Rekindling, but it's so difficult to get Rekindling online for real value. Normally, it's just like reborning a Stardust is basically all that Rekindling is in the deck. And you can get huge Rekindlings, but again, like I said, every huge Rekindling just loses to Caius. And if you don't just kill your opponent that turn, if they have like any stop to your OTK with your 4 or 5 Rekindling, it's probably not happening. It's very easy to break most of the boards that you can make with Flamvel. And the best argument for it is that it can play Gravekeeper Spy, which is really good against Blackwing and zombies, and almost good against Value. But I would not trust the deck. I enjoy the deck decently, but even for casual gameplay, I feel like it's just one of your worst options. If you're sufficiently skilled with it, then you can get a top, but I would not expect to win anything. And it's most certainly one of the decks that I respect the least on this list when I am thinking about like what I'm going to side for, because I mean, you already have Cyber Dragons, you're probably already maining Bottomlesses and at least siding, if not maining, Dimensional Prisons for the rest of the meta. It loses to all the same things that the top decks do without any of the power plays or any of the ways to play through or get around them. Just solidly not a good option. It's very D tier. Dark Turbo, very bricky deck. It's just, I think it's worse than Dragon Turbo. It plays the Dark Creator, Red Eyes Darkness Metal, Dark Horus. And while everything in the deck does work with Dark Grepher, which is the premier card of the deck, obviously, it's like Dark Grepher quickly unbricks you, kind of, puts all your stuff in the grave. It's you have Nordlurus and Phantom of Chaos in most builds of it. I don't remember if Pete says the most recent build that he took to Ribbit Rulers. He is, by the way, the only person to top of the deck. I don't know if his recent build at Ribbit Rulers still plays those cards. I assume that it does. Nordlurus is a very powerful card. It's Chaos Emperor Dragon with a draw. So, that is pretty much the one power play the deck has. It's better than anything else in the format, but it's not enough, and it's just most definitely not enough. Welladad, I gotta put this in D tier. It's just a worse Diva Zombie all around. It's yeah. I've talked about this deck at length before. In theory and in practice, it's just not as good as Diva Zombie. You can listen to my rant with James. You can listen to my other video where I talk about deck building and like how to look at your deck's hands just to see how the deck is and like practice that. But KFC, I think this deck is solidly C tier. Probably maybe better than Quick Draw, maybe worse. I'm not sure. Regardless, I think this deck is really cool. I said in my last video I don't like it, but that's because I couldn't come up with a good reason to put it in F tier. I think the deck's actually really cool. I think it has a lot of potential and options, especially for the way Carpath's doing it, but at the same time, I think if the deck is getting better by adding more cards and more synergies with Kuraz, instead of like capitalizing on the synergies it already has, then you're just kind of like bloating the deck in a way that makes me unsure if it's actually functioning correctly. And I would really have to see his new build in action, but I don't hate the deck at all. I think it's actually a very, very cool deck, but I also don't trust anyone that's not Carpath to like do anything with it. There are probably a few people who can play the deck to a top cut, but on the whole, I think the deck is just kind of bricky. I think it has potential, but it's not really fully unlocked yet. I think it has the same issue as Quick Draw, where it plays stupid cards like Lone Fire and Titanial. And between like the Dandelion and the Debris, it's a Quick Draw deck without Quick Draw. I mean, they're pretty much the same deck, but instead of the Quick Draw or Dandy Drill Warrior loop, you have like Kuraz plussing off of the Dandy tokens, which is pretty cool, but it doesn't always amount to winning the game. And whereas when the combos that these other decks in the S and A tier want to do, when those decks get to their combos, they do win the game. And I think KFC kind of has this issue where it just doesn't always win the game just because it's doing what it wants to do. Finally, these last two decks. We'll talk about Aliens first because it's an archetypal deck, very easy to talk about. Aliens are solidly D tier, obviously. They are definitely the worst deck in the D tier. And they're just not consistent in the slightest. Golgar is a very good card, but the deck obviously does not function nearly as well as even Quick Draw. Like, the normal summon, revive from grave, make a synchro is not as good as any of these other deck synchro plays. And Golgar requires too many moving parts to actually function. It requires too much back row, so you have to dedicate slots to Starlight Road, or just get very lucky if your opponent doesn't have Heavy Storm. The only person to get a top 4 or top 8 at all, I think he got top 4 of it, but was Alethea, who is just insane at playing stupid decks and playing them very, very well. I think he would tell you, like, he was not playing Aliens because he thought it was a good meta call. He was playing it because there was an extra prize for finishing like with the highest placing alien list, because the only time it got a top was in Pumpkin of Games 2, where there was an additional prize for the top placing alien list. So yeah, obviously aliens are the worst deck that has gotten a top thus far, and it's honestly very surprising to me that aliens have gotten a top and X-Sabers have not, which is why X-Sabers not on this list. X-Sabers have not gotten a top 8 in 2 years of Edison format gameplay, at least not at like a major online tournament. Plenty of locals, X-Sabers have, done well or whatever. But none of the tournaments that I am aware of have X-Sabers gotten a top 8, which is pretty sad because they are much better than probably all 4 of these decks. But yeah, so Alien solidly D tier. Deck's cool, but it's obviously not good. And finally, the other Alephia deck, the Chaos Pile. This deck also only got one top slot. That was Ribbit 5, I believe. It was Ribbit 4 or 5. Alephia got, I think, top 4 with that as well, or maybe it was top 8. I don't remember exactly which top it was, but I know it's only topped once. And the deck is actually really good against Blackwing. Like, for those of you who don't know about this deck is basically Hero Beat. He plays Stratos 3 Alias, he plays 2 Gemini Spark, and I don't think he plays any Hero Blast, but he plays 3 Gatekeeper Spy, he plays Caius, and of course Chaos Sorcerer, and I'm pretty sure Dark Armed, because he has enough Darks for it. And the deck is actually surprisingly well equipped against Blackwing and zombies because of Gatekeeper Spy, the same thing that I said about Flamvel, except that because this deck plays hero cards instead of Flamvel cards, I think it's actually better. And I don't know that anyone other than Alephia would actually ever play it and top of it ever again, but I think this deck is actually solidly a C tier deck. I think that the Alephia Chaos Pile is probably as good as Gladiator Beast or KFC in the present Edison meta because Gravekeeper Spy is actually a pretty good card. It blocks all of the Blackwings that are not boosted by Kalut. It blocks all of the zombie little guy attacks, and of course zombies don't really care about whatever you're doing if they can get to Brio, so we're not even going to talk about that. It plays the Hero Beat stuff, but it plays a watered down engine, so I don't think it's actually as good as just regular Hero Beat or Diva Hero Beat, because I think Chaos Sorcerer and Dark Armor are a little bricky in it. Caius, Spy Caius is pretty good, but Spy Caius is like a worse Hamster Ryko Caius, I think, and so for that reason I can't in good conscience place it above C tier. It's somewhere in here alongside these decks, but I honestly literally think it's probably as good as KFC or Quick Draw or even Gladiator Beasts. Yeah, so this is a real tier list. This is not a joke. This is not some kind of meme. This is my actual opinion on the format. These orders are not necessarily how I feel about the decks within the tier. Again, I just place them there. You can argue about that in the comments. You can tag me on Discord, tell me how stupid I am. But yeah, I think that this is a pretty solid baseline tier list for the format, for the topping decks, and when X-Sabers top, I think I would put X-Sabers in C tier for the record. X-Sabers is probably the only deck that has not topped that I think is like a real deck in the format, so we can just have an imaginary X-Sabers in C tier here and say they got a top in spirit. Yeah, so yeah, I think this is actually pretty solid, pretty accurate tier list. No jokes, no memes here. Yeah, see you later, guys.